welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening, for braving the weather out there. We really appreciate all of you coming out. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam. I'm one of the co-owners of the Norwich Bookstore, the store you find yourself in of this slightly stormy evening. And on behalf of all of us, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here into our reading space, whether you've been here many times before or whether this is your first time or first time in a while. Before we get started, just a couple of announcements to make. If I could please ask you to turn off your cell phones, pagers, electronic devices, anything that might make noise. And of course, this is especially important tonight because, as you can see, we've got quite a contraption here through which we are beaming the great Tom Barbash in from the West Coast. And we're so glad that Tom's joining us this evening. And we are also recording this event tonight for Jam. Jam is, of course, our local community media center. They are formerly known as CATV, and they are now still your cable access channel, but they're also so much more, a local media incubator, an education center, an event space. They produce a podcast that you can hear the dulcet tones of my voice talking about books on once in a while. Check them out, uvjam.org. You can see recordings of talks like this, other talks that we have done, many other events from around the Upper Valley, and there's sure to be something you'll enjoy, so do check them out as well. And thank you to Jordan from Jam for recording tonight and helping me set up this whole setup so that we can have Tom here. The other announcement I have, of course, is about books. We are here to celebrate all the many works of Howard Frank Mosher this evening, but especially two new reissues from Brandeis University Press. They are the reissue of Where the Rivers Flow North with an introduction from Peter Orner, and the new edition of Marie Blythe with an introduction from Tom Barbash. We've got copies of both of these new reissues back at the counter, along with many of Mosher's other novels and collections. We've also got, of course, books from Peter Orner, and I think we've even got a few from Tom Barbash. So if you are so moved at the end of the evening, please go check out our wares back there, and Ashley would be happy to help you out, and I'm sure that Peter will be willing to inscribe his introduction for you if you so desire. And we thank you. Your book purchase is, of course, what allows us to keep doing this and keep publishers like Brandeis able to produce works like this. So we're grateful. And now, without further ado, I am so delighted to welcome in person, in real time, in the flesh, Peter Orner, 3-time recipient of the Pushcart Prize, the author of 6 books, including Esther Stories, which was a PEN/Hemingway Award finalist. Orner, of course, directs the creative writing program at Dartmouth College, and we are so pleased to call him a local author. His latest book is Still No Word From You. And joining us via the awesome power of the internet tonight is Tom Barbash. He is the author of the award-winning novel The Last Good Chance and of the novel The Dakota Winters. He currently teaches in the MFA program at California College of the Arts and grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He currently lives in California, from where he's joining us tonight. And we are so grateful to have Tom here with us. Tonight, of course, we're talking about the great Vermont novelist Howard Frank Mosher. He was described by the Los Angeles Times as a combination of Ernest Hemingway, Henry David Thoreau, and Jim Harrison. And he was the author of countless books, among them Northern Borders, Where the River Flows North, which we're going to be discussing tonight, A Stranger in the Kingdom, which was a winner of the New England Book Award for Fiction, and Marie Blythe. And now, to discuss the legacy of Mosher in real time from two coasts, because that's how far that legacy stretches, Peter Orner and Tom Barbash. Thank you.
I talk in here, Jordan? In here.
I can hear you.
You can hear me, good. Okay, and you can, good. Well, thanks everybody for coming in person and online. Are we live online? We are live online, right? Good. So thanks, Jam, for doing this. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Sam, so much. Thanks, Norwich Bookstore. We're so lucky to have you guys here in our community, and I'm real honored to be here tonight to talk about Howard Frank Mosher. And we thought, Tom and I thought we'd start by discussing why Mosher now. I think one of the things that I think we're both interested in, Tom and I, are people who are sometimes, for whatever reason, not forgotten, but maybe overlooked in a way that they shouldn't be. And I think Mosher might be in that category. He was a very prolific author. He had a great deal of success in his lifetime. But, times change, things move on, and, books fall out of print or for whatever reason. And sometimes publishers like university presses, like Brandeis University Press, picks up where commercial publishers maybe leave off. And I know Mosher's still in print by some of his larger publishers, but these are two really important books of Mosher that have been brought out by Brandeis. And so I really appreciate the work that Brandeis has done to make sure that Mosher reaches a new audience. So, Tom, I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about why Mosher now and what is it about him that makes him unique and still not just relevant, but still great.
Well, he's just an amazing storyteller, and I think of a lot of the things that people are getting out of long form TV, out of their Netflix or Amazon accounts, or they're getting from movies, people moving away from books to long form serial TV. Mosher wrote for that audience. I mean, this Marie Blythe is just, it's so cinematic. It's so exciting. It's hair raising. You can't believe the things that are happening. You have to sort of, every once in a while, I felt like I had to put the book aside and just catch my breath or sort of walk around the house a little bit. It's exciting in ways that, I guess he reminds me a little bit of John Irving, because there's also a wicked sense of humor and the characters are big and juicy. But, it also, this character, Marie Blythe, reminded me of I thought of True Grit. When I read this, of Maddie Ross, the girl in that, but it's just fun and gritty and textured, and so much in the way of landscape. He's such a Vermont writer because I'm out in California, but my first job, Peter and I have talked about it. I was a reporter for the Syracuse Post-Standard stationed in Oswego, New York, where it snowed for 27 straight days. The winter I was there. And so, yeah, so Mosher is, I so know the lives of some of these people, and it's just he's terrific, and I hadn't read a book like this in a long time, and I hadn't realized how much I needed it. So.
I think that's great. That speaks so, well to sort of that he's in our midst, and he's a name we know, but maybe we don't look to him as much as we should. And I feel the same way. The book that I introduced is a lot different, Where the Rivers Flow North. It's actually technically Mosher's first book, although it was published second. In the vagaries of publishing, he had to publish a novel first, but this is a collection with a novella in it. The title story is a novella, and I was struck years ago reading it, and it stuck with me ever since. About how visceral it was. Just purely, just like scene-wise, just like he's creating a world on the page that, we could talk till we're blue in the face about how to do this. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how he does it, but I know that he is concentrating so much on what he's seeing, and then he's able to translate that to us. But as you say, he's also really funny, and he's also irreverent in ways that you kind of think of him a little bit, almost as a certain type of a person as a writer, and he blows that out of the water when you start reading him. There's nothing conservative about him. There's nothing at all run-of-the-mill about this guy. I think also he fades into the woodwork as a person, and I think what his concern was, and I think this puts him in the category of Faulkner and other people who weren't characters in their own books necessarily. I'm sure there's characters in some of Mosher's books that are based on himself, but mostly I think he was looking out at the people that he lived among for 5 decades, 6 decades, and he was trying to get them on the page in ways that, again, are funny, irreverent, respectful, and also disrespectful. I don't think he's trying necessarily to prop up Vermont in some ways, as I say in my introduction. A lot of his characters want to get the hell out of Vermont. Can I say that on the air? This is not a love fest of upper New England.
And they're real villains, at least in the book I read.
Right.
So it's not a love fest in terms of the characters. Hearing you speak and thinking of some things that popped up when I was reading it. He must have been influenced by, or he reminds me of Sherwood Anderson in Winesburg, Ohio, because the way of taking, he's got small lives, neglected lives, and creating big stories around them. And he's fascinated by process of blue collar labor jobs. He just knows so many little worlds and embeds them with life. Like he doesn't, the things that would slip through the cracks for other writers don't escape him.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Anderson. I mean, I think he's definitely there, and Faulkner too. And there's obviously a lineage between those two, but very much Faulkner in the book that I introduced. But I also think, like, unlike Anderson, my sense is, and I wonder what you think of this, like that there's not the despair of kind of like Ohio and kind of, I think the difference is that his characters live in Vermont and that gives them a certain lifeblood. They may not always be happy. They're too busy working. But it's like there's not that kind of Andersonian kind of, people living lives of quiet desperation kind of thing,
right.
In my view.
Right. Yeah, no, and Marie, I mean, it's a different sort of desperation, but one from which she emerges triumphant, but not without a lot of pain along
right.
the way. So.
And that's similar, I think, to the character Bangor in the title story, Where the Rivers Flow North, who's a wonderful, if problematic, character, in a way that just fascinated me reading this, rereading it over after so many years. How about we read a little bit?
Yeah.
I'll just read a tiny bit from my introduction just to give a sense of my take on this, and it'd be great if you did the same. I recently reread the book you were holding for the first time in more than 20 years. Isn't it true that only a few remain with us? Think of all the books that don't, no matter how much we may have appreciated them, even loved them at the time, about which we retain nothing. And it's strange, you can't really predict which ones will stick. Where the Rivers Flow North, Howard Frank Mosher's first book, though it was published after he completed his first novel in 1978, is one of my handful. And over the years, I've often thought about a woman named Bangor who, in her grief, used her lover's hook. Her lover has a hook instead of a hand, to etch, because of a long ago accident, to etch a single word on the backside of a grave. It's 1927 or 1928. She's wearing a red dress. The rain has turned to snow, as it has tonight. Up at the camp, a fire. The fact that this image of Bangor in her red dress holding Noel's hook has stayed with me is in itself a testament to this book's uncanny power. As a fiction writer, I can only hope against hope that a single one of my own creations might remain lodged in one reader's mind for 20 years. 2 decades ago, I knew nothing at all about Vermont, had never set foot in the state. I was a Chicagoan living in California. I was in my late 20s. Vermont was as far from my consciousness as Bangladesh. This is a bad joke. I didn't know Ethan Allen from Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now I live here, though I'm a damn downstater of the sort that many of Mosher's people would disdain, like those 2 idiot cousins in a story called First Snow. But at least, thank God, I'm not from Massachusetts. I've been wondering what drew me to the book back then. And this is something I thought a lot about. What is it that drew me to it? And one thing I really love are place names in fiction. And there's nobody better, I think, than Howard Frank Mosher at place names. I share with Mosher his reverence for place names. They appear in this book like tiny 1, 2, or 3-word poems. Owlhead, Camel's Hump, Lord's Bog, Upper Lord's Hollow, Jay's Peak, Kingdom Fair. Still, as much as I'd have admired his descriptive prose, I'm not sure I'd have recognized then just how difficult it is to translate what you see in the distance onto the page. As integral, though, as land is to these stories, I know that what impacted me most in the 90s and again in 2022 are the connections between Mosher's characters. It's his people like Frog Mundy, Forrest Gleason, Whiskey Jack Kennison, all the Kennisons. Henry Colville is a particular favorite of mine. An older brother named Waterman, a woman named Burrell, Gordon, Ordney, Armand, St. Ange, Abigail, Lowell Nord, Bangor. When these people fight, when they fall in love, when they grieve, there's consequence. These stories are grounded in the dailiness of hard work. Outside, in unusually harsh weather, these characters aren't to take an easy pot shot at myself as much as anybody else, texting their angst into a cell phone. Mosher's people wouldn't understand how anybody could have such time on their hands. They're too busy working. And in the introduction, I give a bunch of examples of him describing work, especially people working outside, but I'm going to give one that is not about people working outside. This is Mosher talking about strippers. Here's Mosher on strippers who work in a carnival traveling through the area. Inside the tent, we sat down on one of the rough wooden benches. There was no band, just the same music that was being piped outside. The two women came out looking bored and took off their clothes like they were tired and getting ready for bed. I mean, priceless. I would love to have written that. And then finally, I'll read a little bit more about Mosher himself to give a little context. Mosher and his wife Phyllis came to the Northeast Kingdom from Syracuse in the late 60s to pursue high school teaching jobs, and they remained there for good. And though Mosher worked for a former whiskey runner and did his time as a logger, it took him years to be considered a Vermonter by his neighbors. Don't I know it? And yet many of Mosher's characters are heading the opposite direction, or at least trying to. They're doing their best to shake Vermont, not embrace it. Even when they leave Kingdom County, they carry it with them. I think of Noel, who leaves for Maine after his legendary father's death and makes his mark as a crew boss in his own right. Or the unnamed dying husband in one of my favorite stories called The Peacock, who leaves to pursue a professional baseball career only to return to Vermont after he's cut from the team, having no money and no place else to go. It pulls you back, Vermont does, and in spite of all the hardship these people endure and all the complaining they do, gossip, school board, taxes, the rapacious Vermont Power Company, this, for better or for worse, is their place, and they know it in their bones. So, gives a little bit of a sense of my take on this collection, which I found wonderful to revisit.
There's so much, there's so many things that I'm seeing in what you just read. Now I have to read that book, but there's baseball in here. I mean, there's just all the dignity of work. Also, the pleasures of reading something before technology, where there's nobody's on a cell phone, nobody's
right.
On their computer.
None of that in Mosher.
Yeah. And I spent a lot of time. Marie Blythe, the character, just so takes over this book that I focused a lot on her in my introduction. But I said I'll just read you a short section from it, where I talked about Mosher in an interview with the Atlantic Unbound. Spoke of how when he first moved north, he, quote, felt like a gold miner who'd hit a mother lode. In Marie Blythe, he's created a heroine for the ages. She reminded me of Maddie Ross in True Grit, wily, tomboyish, precocious, equally capable of standing up to the bad guys, no interest in becoming a lady, no eyes on, and she hasn't set her eyes on a suitor, doesn't dream of becoming a movie star or moving to Hollywood or becoming an artist. Readers might be tempted to call her an early feminist, but she's less insurgent than simply unwilling to live by another's standards. A gritty survivor with a gift for mastering new trades like scraping stovepipes and hoeing hen houses, and traditionally male pastimes like hunting and fishing. Alone, she stalks a deer for 3 days and finally, channeling her great-great-great-grandmother, fells it with an axe and takes a bite of its heart. She really does that. When she becomes orphan, Marie moves in with a band of local nomads, cuts her hair short, dresses like a boy, and becomes a heralded wrestler. She's later taken in by the Benedicts and begins a fraught romance with the handsome and capricious Abby. Over and over, Mary finds ways not to simply endure, but to thrive despite real poverty and continuous encounters with dangerous men. With no family to support her and without a reliable community, she survives on an inexhaustible belief that a better life lies ahead. Time and again, she returns to the Benedict family, whose wealth and standing are things of local myth. Abraham Benedict is a classic example of early 20th century American ambition. Fortunes rise behind his ingenuity and the knowledge he honed captaining lumber ships. Tall tales claim he cleaned the peninsula single-handedly. The side characters are invariably complex, brave in one instance, and cowardly in the next. Because it's Vermont, weather is always front and center. Sultry summer days pounding rain and snowstorms, and a biblical flood rendered through Mosher's descriptive powers. Quote, by noon, the brooks coming off Kingdom and Canada mountains were over their banks and cutting swaths 50 to 60 feet wide down the mountainsides. Boulders weighing up to a ton came tumbling down the stream beds as though hurled by giants. The lower road on Kingdom Mountain was a raging river, and the road going up School Hill from the village to the big house was a cascade. I thought more than once, reading these sections of my days as a reporter in upstate New York, where it might blizzard in May, burying my rust-covered car, and then flip to summer, skipping spring altogether, as though Mother Nature forgot. Like Mosher, I remember feeling attuned then. Like Mosher's Vermont, it was a tough place in which to make your living. I remember feeling attuned then, like Mosher, to the strange and compelling stories around me yet to be told, though I didn't stay long enough to hit the mother lode the way he did. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's great, Tom. That's great. The idea, reminds me of when you say the side characters are invariably complex. It reminds me of one of your famous quotes that I'm always quoting, which is when you said minor characters don't know they're minor. I mean, he's a great example of that. There's not a character in the book that I wrote about that feels not delineated, not cared about. Even if they're just a passing. Even if they're just a waiter in a hotel, he pays attention to each person.
And I don't know if you see it in the stories too, but in the novels, you've decided that you really love a character, and for a good period of time, maybe for a couple chapters, and then the character turns and they're terrible. So it's there's surprises and changes and shifts, and it's because they're three-dimensional, living, breathing beings.
That's a great. I mean, No Lord in Where the Rivers Flow North is exactly that. You get different senses of him almost from page to page. You love him and you hate him. He's cruel. He's hilarious, and yet he's not somebody I necessarily would want to spend time with, much less live with, as Bangor does. But she loves him in spite of everything, and. You also say, it's interesting to think about the women characters who are so important to both of these books, and that his attention to them, and yet not, as you say, kind of making any kind of sweeping statements. They're totally of themselves. They're not of a movement, let's say.
Yeah. Although I do think it's funny because there's mentions of the politics outside of this, but you sort of feel it. A lot of the class issues, a lot of sort of the struggles of early industrialism, in the 20th century. There's a whole bunch of things, the effects of which you feel, aspects of unionization. So you feel all those factors coming in.
Yeah, it's not polemical. I mean, he's not, everybody's too busy working. Everybody is too busy working. Just every character, and so therefore they don't necessarily have, and also the Northeast Kingdom's, is arguably cut off from a lot else that's going on in Boston or wherever else, right? So I feel like there's a sense of isolation that these characters also experience. But again, I think they don't have too much time to be thinking about that either. I think that's what strikes me, is the amount of work that's going on in the stories that I read.
Also, there's tremendous violence in Marie Blythe. You watch murders. She literally rips the heart out of a deer and takes a bite out of it. She ends up in prison. She's in a sanatorium. She works in a tuberculosis clinic, and nothing is edited out. And she doesn't flinch. And but there's incredible humanity. But that aspect of it, there's stomach turning things in here. It's crazy. I just felt like it was so alive in that way, and so unflinching.
I think that's a great way to put it. Just the lifeblood on the page. What I'm always talking to my students about. That's all I'm looking for. It doesn't matter how you get there. But I think with Mosher, he was just down on the ground with his people. And I want to quote from a story that I really like. It's called Kingdom County Come, and it's Mosher. Is also known for, kind of elements of magicalness. I don't know how I would put it. necessarily, but things happen in some of these stories that are, out of the realm a little bit, in ways that I believe and that happen every day. But this is a moment when a guy named Colville, he's dying, and one of the things he sees before he dies, well, he goes off by himself, paddling away off by himself, and he, in one of his dying moments, he has a conversation with his dead father. Inside the beaver house, it was dusky, like the lumber camp after supper on long ago winter evenings when the men had talked by kerosene light for an hour or two before sleeping. Colville was not surprised to look up and see his father sitting in the dusk across the pile of alder sticks. So he's gone into a beaver house. And there he sees his father. Nothing surprised Colville now, and he was puzzled by nothing. He understood that everything that had happened had helped him prepare for this time and this place. "It goes down good," Colville said, offering the bottle. His father shook his head, so Colville drank again. "It does go down smooth. I could have used a sup in that army hospital over across. They didn't have any stock, though, so you had to pray instead. I'd try to say the Lord's Prayer, but I was fevered with a lung rotting away inside my chest, and I couldn't seem to get the words to come out right. And it would always come out to thy instead of thy kingdom come, it would come out kingdom county come instead. I was in fever, you see. I'd get sidetracked, but that would put me in mind of home. And then I'd commence to thinking about the bog in June, with the forest frogs a-singing, when you and me would come up here in the backflows and catch us 20 or 30 speckled trout a pound or more apiece, laying there on the narrow little army cot with men and boys a-dying all about me. I'd come near to smelling them trout frying, come near to tasting them. You can't fight the government, Colville's father said to him. You can't fight for it, and you can't fight against it. I could have told you so, but I knew that would be something you would have to learn by yourself. Yes, Colville said. He drank again. His father waited, grave and attentive, though not looking directly at him, but through the opening and on into some private distance, as though, Colville thought, into that bourne beyond which, and then he realized that his father had not returned, but that he had come to that place where his father had been waiting, that it was himself, not his father, who had made the journey, was making the journey. So it gets a little, metaphysical there at the end. He sort of switched places with his father, and that's actually the moment of Colville, his demise. But it's I remember that scene when I was thinking about preparing for tonight, and how that conversation that he had with his dead father was really striking.
Amazing. I wanted to read a couple things about just sort of work, which and then one about her in a tuberculosis clinic. There's tons of things about, so I could have picked any one of these about
right.
Sort of the gritty work she does. The rest of the winter, she cut ice on pond in the sky. She began work each day at first light by hitching her horses to a wooden plow and scraping off any snow that had fallen onto the ice during the night. When the pond was clear of snow, she hitched onto a steel plow and began dividing the ice into grids 4 feet long by 2 feet wide. Jigger showed her how to make the first cut just an inch deep, and then to go over the same furrow again and again until she was down nearly a foot. While she went on to make another grid, sawyers with iron-handled hand saws cut through the furrows to the water below. Men called tampers filled the spaces cut between the ice with snow so they wouldn't freeze over again. Then the sawyers made a channel to the conveyor chains leading up to the ice house, and floats of ice cakes weighing 500 to 600 pounds apiece were shoved through the open water to the chain by the tampers using wooden picaroons with double steel points. When she was on the ice, Marie dressed in long flannel underwear, a pair of flannel pajamas, wool pants, overalls, 2 shirts, 3 pairs of men's woolen stockings, a lined sheep coat, a knitted wool face mask. There's so much detail here, and India rubber gumboots. Yet if she stopped moving for 2 minutes, she got cold. Twice the temperature dropped to 45 below zero, and often when it was 20 below or lower, the wind blew hard. But she liked the long regular hours and the men she worked with, and she especially liked the horses, a gelding and a mare, no longer good for woods work, but careful and patient on the ice. At the end of her second week on the job, she bought several spools of different colored ribbon, blue and pink and bright yellow, and decorated their working harnesses. And to the vast amusement of Jigger, she braided their manes and bought each of them a brass tailband, which he polished like the brass balls on the top of the parlor stove at the big house.
That's great.
But just a sense of her personality, and then the crazy work. And then here, just from her time in the tuberculosis clinic, Mary struggled with what little strength she had left, but the women cut off her wind with one arm and then proceeded to shear her like a sheep. She gets her hair cut. Along with her hair, Mary lost her spirit to keep going. That day she succumbed to the fever she had fought off for weeks, and when she woke up 3 nights later and remembered who and where she was genuinely surprised that she was still alive. She was thirsty, but the aid had gone out, and the water pitcher was at the far end of the room. Years later, when she had time and inclination to think about the course of her history, she had no doubt that the hour after she woke from the 3-day delirium at the sanatorium was among the most important in her life. She had no visionary dream, heard no mysterious voices. It was not a religious or hallucinatory experience, but much more ordinary than that. She simply knew in that hour of lucidness that her life was probably in her own hands, and she felt two opposite and nearly equal inclinations. One was to lie back and let events run their course, which would be the same as letting go and dying. The other was to get up, if possible, and get a drink for herself and refuse to give in, to go on fighting the fever and the infection and the seductive prospect of an end to all pain and difficulties forever. And this inclination was slightly more powerful, though she lay still, gathering resolve and strength for at least another hour before sitting up and then standing up and then walking one short step at a time to the end of the room for a drink.
That's great. That's great. I love the time shift, that leap ahead, that leap in years. Yeah. And then she's remembering something that, wasn't, kind of that easy to, like something almost ordinary, from that time. It's amazing. I think, it's, I think one of the things that's really interesting about him for me also, and it kind of relates to what the scenes you were setting just now, is the way that he does set up, like visually, the landscape of the moment that when a story starts. So this is the wonderful opening of Where the Rivers Flow North. During the summer of 1927, it did not rain in Kingdom County for 3 months. Occasionally, towards the end of a hot day in haying time, thunderheads would build up in the west, and there would be a hard rain on Mount Mansfield or Jay Peak. Sometimes it rained on Owlhead across the border in Quebec. There was no drought in New Hampshire or Maine or in the Adirondacks of New York, but from late May until early September, not a drop of rain fell in the hill country of northeastern Vermont. Then, late one afternoon, when the swamp maples along the Lower Kingdom River had started to turn red for the fall, the rain came suddenly, slanting down from the mountains onto the sleep slate roofs in the village of Kingdom Common. The old men sitting out on the hotel porch went to the rail and held out their hands. They looked skeptically towards the obscured mountains, then returned to their chairs without speaking. I love that. The rain fell lightly on the brown hayfields along the county road east of the village and on the sere brown woodlots along dirt roads running back into the myriad dead-end hollows between the hills. Farmers, standing or squatting in their baked dooryards, held out their hands and looked hopefully towards the mountains. Out at the end of the county road, engineers and construction men looked at the clouds and hoped the shower would blow over into Canada before the river started to rise. And that's just setting the, he's sort of like, that's the bird's eye view of this place in Kingdom Common, and then starting out with the drought and then the rain's coming, and then the story's going to gradually, in the next few paragraphs, get narrower and narrower, and you're going to see one character, Noel Lord, who's the star of this, along with Bangor. But I love how that wide angle opens it up. I just think it's just a wonderful way to open a story.
Yeah, and he opens in this, because of the novel, he'll open chapters of it. But I remember, Peter, we were always told, you and I both went to Iowa, we were told at some point that weather was a character,
Yes.
and, or that it could be. And here it's such a force,
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
Yeah.
Landscape and weather, because there's a huge flood in this. I mean, there's all sorts of, it's such a factor, and it completely changes storylines. So whatever plans you have, it's just like Everybody Tonight, I guess.
Right. No, exactly. And I'm from Chicago. I never thought so much about weather until I got here. You know what I mean? Like we had certainly had weather in Chicago, God knows, but we weren't obsessed with it like we are here. I'm just looking at the opening of the novel. Would you read that? Because I think it's a good counterpoint. And I forget exactly when Mary Blythe was written in relationship to Where the Rivers Flow North, but it looks like about 10-year difference. So this is a writer coming into his own, whereas Where the Rivers Flow North is, somebody who's still getting used to what they're doing, even though I think he started out as a master.
Yeah. In the spring of 1899, 6 families set out on foot through Lower French Canada. They left at dawn in a hard rain, walking south beside their oxen along the St. Francis River. And as they departed, they sang a song their ancestors had sung more than a century ago on their way to Canada from France, a rondel in 2 parts, with the men singing the verses and the women joining in with the refrain. Despite the rain, it was a morning of high promise. The air was fresh with the sense of thawing mud and running water. The mist over the river was full of the harsh, eager calls of wild ducks and geese, which by nightfall would be halfway to Hudson's Bay. Heading south through the rain, the singing people were full of hope. They traveled by easy stages, pausing often to rest, since the track they followed was too muddy for carts, and everyone had to carry as much as possible. The men carried lumbering tools, the women carried household utensils and extra clothing tied up in quilts, and the dozen or so children who had survived the smallpox epidemic that had ravaged the settlements along the St. Francis the previous winter carried sacks of bread to eat on the way. The rain drove harder, saturating the dark warm coast. Sorry.
It's great. Oh, it's all good. I mean, to get back to our original question.
Hillary.
It's Tom's wife.
My wife, yes. I have to quickly text her.
While you're doing that, I'll put something in your ear, and that is, what strikes me is why Mosher now, just in terms of like being a writer and a reader, it's patience. This is incredibly patient work, and I feel like we're in a torrent of impatience lately. I know I am, and I feel like Mosher, if Mosher did one thing for me while I was working on this intro, and I wonder if you had the same feeling, is it just slowed me down and made me just concentrate more. And that's the best kind of writing. And it's a shame that that he's not more celebrated than he is, but there are huge Mosher fans out there. Maybe we'll hear from them in a moment. But this is just really important work. And like a Vermonter, he didn't make a show of himself. One thing that Sam of Norwich Books mentioned when we talked about Mosher a while back, if you recall, Sam, you said, because Sam used to run a bookstore on the West Coast, and had remembered Mosher coming out and giving readings, and he was somebody who was a workaday writer. Sam was saying that he didn't always draw like a huge crowd, even though they made 4 films of his work, and he was a big name. Yeah, he was not a he won all Guggenheims, all the things, but I think he was also he put his head down, and he did this. And I think when he got out on the road, which I think he liked to do, I think he just did his thing too. And maybe there wasn't 150 people, but he was always out there doing it, even when there wasn't a film with Michael J. Fox in it, which I haven't seen, but apparently Michael J. Fox is in Where the Rivers Flow North, and I can't quite believe it, but that's the case. Anyway, so have you seen any of his films?
Yeah, no, but so you and I should have a Mosher Film Festival, you know. But there's a lot of the same people and directing and stuff that goes. So there were people who loved him the way we love him and just decided. And there's no doubt, reading this, what a great movie it would make. You know, I think if they made it back then, someone should remake it because. I mean, it's amazing.
I think it's an interesting thing to think about the combination of like patience and cinematicness. Like I think he was really focusing on how to create a visual picture in a reader's head. And again, sometimes people are shortcutting that. I know I am sometimes. So that's why I think it was wonderful to revisit him after all those years. Maybe we should open it up for any thoughts or questions. What do you think?
Yeah, sure.
If anyone has any of those. Is there people online or anybody in the crowd?
Well, if anyone
Yes.
has questions here in the crowd, I'll check
Yeah, we
this
want
out as well.
want to give you a chance to, and Sam, you're welcome to weigh in as well. But any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
I have one.
Yes.
Do the movies have the same titles as the books? Are they easy to find that way?
I believe so. Yeah, as far as I know.
Peter, can you repeat the question?
Oh, the question is do the movies have the same titles as the books?
Yeah.
And I think there is something about that filmmaker Jay Craven adapted 4 of Mosher's novels into feature films: Disappearances, Where the Rivers Flow North, Strangers in the Kingdom, and Northern Borders. All of those are Mosher titles, so easy to find. And I do believe that Jay Craven, very well-known filmmaker, and there were big stars in these movies at the time.
I saw Where the Rivers Flow North 30 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I'm finally getting around to reading the book.
Oh, okay.
I'm about to.
Oh, good.
Fabulous movie, very intense, and the cinematography was gorgeous.
Huh.
It was done in St. Johnsbury, and the wood scenes were off at Notch, New Hampshire.
Uh-huh.
And I think some other locations as well.
The gentleman's talking about the movie of Where the Rivers Flow North being a particularly beautiful movie cinematically and cinematography-wise and elsewhere. Filmed about an hour from here in St. Johnsbury, which I think would be technically south of Mosher country, if I understand, but getting there. Close enough, yeah.
Big city.
Yeah, right, it's the big city. I love St. Johnsbury. Sir?
The only one I've read is Strangers in the Kingdom.
Uh-huh.
Is it different in any way, say, particular, or is it really straight, very much like the others?
I think my experience, and it's been too long for me to speak to that title necessarily, but I think there's a sense of you're reading Mosher, but the books are different. In the way that William Faulkner might be different. He's always trying something different. But in these books, the 2 books that we're doing tonight, they're very different. And yet you've got a baseball player coming back, and a lot of the motifs return. But I think just in my limited, I'm not a Mosher scholar, but I think his style developed. I think in some ways it got, as a lot of great writers this happens, so it got simpler as he got older. Borges, the same thing. But Rivers One North, you can feel the sort of cadences of the sentences being quite long in a lot of places, which I think is a Faulknerian influence. But in later books, it's more direct and more plain spoken, and I think he sort of developed in that direction. Is my very limited and admittedly perhaps simplistic notion.
Peter, I was thinking, years ago I had to review a novel by Ann Tyler, and it was probably given her 15th book, probably about Baltimore. And what I was thinking about it is there was she's a great writer, but there wasn't as much texture about Baltimore, and I thought that she probably just thought, I've already put that texture in because it's a later book. And so one of the things about Marie Blythe is everything's in there. I mean, it's because it's early in his career, and he has no assumption that he should hold back on texture anywhere. I mean, it's packed with it. So I don't know if there's maybe like a little bit less as you move through, through later novels, possibly because so much has been in his earlier novels.
Maybe. maybe, for sure. I mean, that's been my experience with a real late book, but it was a book of essays, and they're just not like the fiction. But I also think like he was constantly finding new stuff to say about Vermont, like Ann Tyler. I mean, she's still out there writing about Baltimore. I mean, in some ways, it's not a bad comparison. Somebody who I think we take Ann Tyler for granted.
Yeah.
Someone's
going to be doing this kind of a night.
Can you believe? I mean, it's almost shocking to believe that is probably true. I mean, Ann Tyler. Yeah, I just think that some people like this who have just been doing it, and again putting their heads down and doing it. I think there's a real a solid comparison, and I love Tyler.
The language that I was talking about in the introduction is. These are people who believe they hit the mother lode. They arrived at a place, and the place kept feeding them stories. It's like,
right.
And as far as he's considered, the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, like it didn't stop giving him stories ever.
It didn't. And of course, how would it, right? And I mean, you say in your introduction, I think it's great. Like if you'd stayed in the Hudson Valley or you'd stayed in upstate New York. You would, but of course you found a mother lode elsewhere, and you also found a mother lode looking backwards. Dakota Winters is a place pretty well from a previous life. So I think, we all do it, but I think Mosher is a great example of somebody who took the place that he landed and just went with it. And he was not a native Vermonter. I mean, he was from a similar, place topographically, I suppose, but Northeast Kingdom is pretty unique. So, the little time I've spent there. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Any other thoughts or questions, comments, Sam?
Well, I'll just add.
Yeah, you're a Mosher scholar.
To the story, because the thing about the story you just told is the one slight chronological details. I never met.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
He was traveling. I think most of his time on the road was just right before I started.
Gotcha.
And I think in later years he maybe stuck a little closer to home. But the part of the story that really just illustrates what you said is he drove.
He drove
to all these events, and in fact, he wrote a memoir about it at one point. I'm forgetting the title of that book, and drove in like a 1980s Chevy subcombat, like a Chevy Citation or something.
Right.
Really, like thousands and thousands of miles. This bookstore was in Bellingham, Washington, which is about as far geographically as you could be
totally.
in the continental United States. But I'd hear these stories about him, and it was kind of holy, like the way these booksellers would talk about him. He drove to Bellingham, Washington to present his books. And when it was a small crowd sometimes, and occasionally it was, because, that's the reality of being a workaday writer, he would be so kind and so humble, and he would talk with the booksellers and talk with whoever was in attendance, and sometimes they'd just talk baseball, which, of course, was a love of his.
Right.
And I never forgot this story, even years before, much like Peter, I ever thought of Vermont or thought of myself as ending up in Vermont. I remembered this story about him. So,
and it's rare. I mean, it's rare. I think that kind of sense of humility and sense of I think he treated being on the road as like the work he did. Like that was meeting readers was, I think, my sense is very important to him. And again, not huge crowds, right? In a lot of cases, and I think that is a testament to, I can see him driving around there. It also reminds me in where the rivers flow north, there's a sort of almost like I might compare it to the, not to be all English professorial, but in the Three Sisters, Chekhov's play, they're wanting to go. They're talking about going to Moscow. They're always talking about going to Moscow. They never make it to Moscow. In where the rivers flow north, they're talking about going to Oregon. It's the promised land is out west in Oregon, and they never make it. And so to think of him driving there in his beater car is a beautiful image, even if it wasn't a beater car. I like the idea. So anyway, Tom, any last thoughts?
Just it's great fun to in this to read these kind of perils. Also, you get this kind of vicarious thrill out of being with someone who's this courageous. There's something about, but it's, the section that I just read, that the courage isn't that she's a superhero. It's that she suffers the same doubts, the same questions, the same fears as anybody else, but she sticks with it and perseveres. And that sort of human triumph, over incredible obstacles, in a way that doesn't feel concocted. It feels ground in gritty detail. It's such a pleasure. It did feel like in that way. So there's so much more humanity in the book than in most books we read. So.
Yeah, I want to give a plug for another, somebody who wasn't from New England who embraced it, and that was my old teacher, Andre Debuse, who ended up living in Haverhill, Massachusetts for much of his life. He was from Louisiana. But, he embraced this place in much different territory than Vermont. But I was thinking about Andre when I was reading this. Again, somebody just put their head down and was worried about sentences, and,
Andre Debuse is somebody who didn't shy away from darkness, for sure.
No, he gets pretty dark. Pretty dark. But he knew darkness. But so does Mosher, in a way. But also there's a lot of comedy in these books, too. A lot of comedy. So, there's definitely lightness, even though I think darkness prevails.
Section, and early in the book when she's a girl where she shaves off her hair and becomes a wrestler and takes on every boy. And it's very, very funny. It's great.
Cool.
One more question.
Oh, we have another question. Yes.
Well, it was just a comment that I don't know whether where you all have an opinion on this, but I think it was in a Vermont Life article that in which Mosher was being interviewed, in which he talked about, and Sam with a car reminded me, he and his wife got an old car and decided they were going to move to California for some reason. Mm-hmm. Drove all the way out to California, was there for just a very short period.
48 hours. Yeah.
Turned right around and came right back.
Was that Peter?
My understanding, and I might be getting the story wrong, and people, might correct us out there, but I believe he had a Stegner. He was admitted to the program, the very prestigious program, great program that Wallace Stegner founded, and Tom was a attendee of. It's one of the hardest, most competitive, and he was there. He got a fellowship, and I just think it wasn't for him. And and what I understand is he turned around and came back. Similar story, Wendell Berry, same thing. Stegner tried to pull Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry said, "I'm going back to Kentucky." And so I think that's what happened to Mosher. That he was at home, felt at home here. I don't know how long he'd been here at that time, so I'm not sure if we're getting the story entirely right. But there's definitely some truth in that he turned around and came back. So.
And yet, if he was in that period, he might have run into people like Ken Kesey and Raymond Carver.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so,
But I think he was content hanging out at the general store.
Yeah.
Yes. As we all ought to be.
Yes. I got to go to Danowitz right now and get waffles for breakfast. So.
Excellent. Well, a great thank you to Peter Orner, to Tom Barbash, to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you for celebrating Howard Frank Mosher with us, and let's hope for Mosher now.
Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Good seeing you. Let's talk. Bye.